when I was about, 19, my family moved to Huntsville. And I had grown up in Chapleau, Ontario. I'd grown up in this tiny little town, in this tiny little high school for all of my life. And I'd already always been a bit of an awkward kid. I was a bit of a nerd. I didn't fit in very well in the town that I grew up in. And then having a dad that was sort of the town missionary kind of thing didn't really help. And so it was always kind of awkward. And then we moved to Huntsville, and I went from a school of like 200 people to a school of like well over 1,000 people. The school that I moved to was half the size of the town I grew up in. And it was a very, very very overwhelming experience for me. And I remember sitting in the hallway in the first or second week that I was there. I remember I wrote in my journal that I was like surrounded by people. I was in a place that had more people in it than I'd ever been in before, almost really. Like, that was in that building at that time. It was wild to me. And I remember sitting in this sea of people, and I wrote in my journal how even sitting in this sea of people, I felt completely and utterly alone. I don't think I'd ever felt more lonely in my entire life. And I remember as a teenager, it just didn't make sense to me that there could be that many people and I could feel this pit of loneliness in my stomach. It didn't matter how many people were around, I still felt lonely. Now, social psychologists who study this kinds of thing, they define loneliness like this. They define loneliness as the gap between the social connections that you would like to have and those you feel you experience, which is very different. The key word there is that word feel, because we have this idea in our minds, because some people have very few friends and aren't lonely. Some people have a lot of friends but are still lonely. I'd actually made some friends in Huntsville. I'd made some acquaintances, some people in the band class and stuff, but I still felt lonely. So I had these social connections, but there was this gap between the connections I had but what I was feeling that I was experiencing, and so I was lonely. Now, this idea of loneliness is becoming more and more of a problem in our society today, because it's this growing problem. In fact, in 2017, the U.S. Surgeon General actually called it an epidemic of loneliness. He was talking about how, and this is 2017, he was talking about how we are more connected than we've ever been. Like this morning, Trevor and Carrie ran the triathlon, and the Vox family group knew about it almost instantly. Like as soon as they crossed the lines, we were being updated. Oh, here we go. Like we're more connected than we've ever been. But we still feel lonely. We still feel disconnected. And people are reporting more loneliness. In 2018, about 22% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now, that's 2018. In 2019, 60% of Americans were reporting feeling lonely. And that's before the pandemic. That's a shocking reality. These are shocking numbers. And I'm willing to bet that many of you are not shocked by that. I'm willing to bet that many of you are looking at that going, yeah, no, I'm totally in that group. Trevor was looking at my pie charts, and I didn't know if I'd screwed up my pie chart. It's very possible that I screwed my pie chart up. It's shocking, isn't it? That's a shocking number. Now, these things, it depends on who did the test, etc. But it doesn't matter. Even if you knock 10% off, you make it just 22 to 50, 22 to 40, 22 to 30 is a huge jump. What is it now? What is it now if we just spent 2 years socially distancing, 2 years isolating, 2 years quarantining, 2 years wearing masks so we can't see each other's faces, 2 years be getting used to hiding in our homes? What is it now? Adult friendships are hard. I saw this thing on Twitter that made me laugh. It was adult friendship equals two people saying, I haven't seen you in forever. We should really hang out more over and over again until one of you dies. The laughter, it's right, isn't it? There's an element of that that's true. There's an element of like, man, we should really do that. There's this joke that it kind of existed before the pandemic, particularly in some of the sort of, 20 to mid-20s to mid-30s age group where the joke was that there's nothing better than flaking on plans. Like people make jokes about how they make plans just for the joy of then not following through on those plans. How much worse has it gotten since we all practiced not doing stuff for the last 2 years? We've all gotten very good at the skill of not doing anything, of not connecting, of isolating. I mean, think about that word. Think about the word that we've been using for 2 years, isolating. We even use it now in sentences. It's like, oh, where's so-and-so? Oh, well, they couldn't make it. They're isolating. And we're all like, oh, okay, we understand that. Recently in our home, there was a joke. I didn't understand that it was a joke. They were talking about somebody, and they said, oh, yeah, he's had sort of a self-imposed isolation. And I thought, oh, did he have COVID? And they were like, no. I was like, oh, just not hanging out with people? I didn't quite understand what was going on. But at the same breath, this language, this word is now part of our commonplace vocabulary. But think about the implications of what it means that we've practiced. We've become better at. We are now skilled isolators. I think that's a problem. When you're a kid, making friends seems so easy in some ways. Especially when you're really little, friendships are based on proximity. Caleb used to be this kid. Anywhere we went, any playground, it didn't matter. In about 5 seconds, he had a new friend. Either some young boy that he was going to play with or an older teenage girl that he had been schmoozing with. It was either one. It didn't really matter. But he could just make friends. But it was proximity. It was just like if you're physically, these people are now your friends. And that's the reality in the younger grades. You kind of have friends because they're next to you. And then as you grow older and you start going through those painful times in sort of the 6 to 8, years where you're now starting to realize that you have friendships based on interests, not just proximity, and that gets painful and difficult. But sometimes as an adult, don't you wish you could go back to when it was easy, when you were a kid, you could just make some friends? I was talking to a young guy recently who is 20, and he said, I just made new friends for the first time in years. Like that. They were not friends, and now they are added to the friend roster because of how hard it is to start making friends the older you get. It's difficult. Now, what researchers look into is they try to figure out why is it as adults that we find it so hard to make friends. I mean, we have proximity still, don't we? We go to work, we have proximity with people at work. Why aren't we friends necessarily? Why don't we necessarily hang out with those people after hours? Right? It's proximity. Why doesn't that translate? Or maybe you go to the gym, or maybe you're in some sort of club, or maybe you're taking a class, or there's lots of proximity opportunities. So why is it so hard? Why do we struggle? Well, researchers seem to think it really comes down to the idea of trust. You see, when you're a kid, you haven't got burned too many times yet. When you're a kid, you're primed to trust almost. That's why we have to tell kids, don't go with strangers, particularly if they have candy, because quite frankly, they don't even necessarily need candy if you don't teach them. Don't go with strangers. So many kids are like, hey, okay, you want me to follow you? I'll follow you, not a problem. We have to say, no, you can't do that. That's bad. Why? Because they didn't get burned yet. And the same is true in relationships. It's like, hey, I'm playing on the monkey bars. Do you want to play and be my friend and we can play on the monkey bars together? Sure, no problem. Because they haven't been betrayed. They haven't been stabbed in the back yet. That little kid didn't gossip about them with somebody else. They didn't find that person, cheating on them with somebody. Do you know what I mean? They're not wrecked yet. I found this quote said, when researchers interviewed adults about making friends in a recent study, the most important challenge cited was lack of trust. People found it harder to put their trust in someone new. And I like this phrase, fully invest in them as a friend compared to when they were younger? We're not sure. I like that idea of an investment. Like, is this one like an investment? We're looking for an investment to pay off. Is this investment in this person going to pay off, or is it not going to? Is it going to become something? Is it going to grow? Is it going to develop? Is it going to become something beautiful, something new, or is it just going to hurt? Because we've been burned too many times as adults. We've all been betrayed at one point or another by somebody that we thought was a friend. We've all been there when somebody that we thought cared about us and knew us came up at the pub and said, "Is this your father?" You know, like we've been hurt deeply by these people. And now we can't trust people anymore. I'm going to have to get a shirt for the next time we play it just for kicks. You know, the I'm with stupid shirt is just going to be like, "No, I'm not his dad," an arrow pointing at Patrick. Won't be a problem. I'm going to go home and put "Just for Men" in my beard, I think, as soon as this is done. No. Anyways, our passage today is shockingly in the book of John. I thought we'd mix it up. It's in John chapter 13, and I want to start verse 21. So the disciples are all sitting around. They're having this Passover feast. It's kind of a long deal, and Jesus has just washed all of their feet. So they're all just sparkling clean and ready to kind of go. And they're all sort of sitting around, and Jesus kind of drops this bomb on them, and it feels like it's out of the blue. It says this: after he said these things, Jesus was deeply disturbed and testified, "I assure you, one of you will betray me." His disciples looked at each other confused about which one of them he was talking about. One of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was at Jesus' side. That is pretty heavy. And for us, we're so used to this story. We're used to this, and we just kind of run through all. They're like, "Yeah, Jesus washes his feet," and we miss the insane reality of that. And then we all kind of know what's coming here, and so we're like, yeah, one of them's going to betray him. But I want you to feel it as if you're one of the disciples sitting there with Jesus, and you're hearing this for the first time. You know it's deeply unsettling for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is they don't understand what he's talking about. Not only do they not know who it is, they don't actually really get what he just said. They just understand that it's not okay. It is heavy and it is definitely unsettling. But I want to leave that for just a second. Because there's a line in here that I love. There's a line in here that I find very interesting. The line is this: one of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was at Jesus' side. And in fact, one of the translations, not only was the one whom Jesus loved at Jesus' side, but he's like reclining on Jesus' chest. He is leaning against Jesus. It's a funny line, right? It's a funny line. Later in verse 24, Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." And leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" This disciple that Jesus loves is literally leaning against Jesus' chest, reclining. And when you were eating in that culture, if you would recline unless you were a servant, you reclined at the table. I'm not really sure if that's good for gestation, really, to be really honest. But you recline, and so he's leaning back against Jesus' chest. I mean, just for a second, think about how close you have to be to somebody, not just physically, but emotionally, to be comfortable leaning against them while you eat dinner. It's a powerful image of closeness and love, and it's one that John has used already. And I think it's why John is using it here. In John chapter 1:18, he says, "No one has ever seen God, God the only Son who is at the Father's side." It's this idea of connection, this idea of the relationship between the Father and the Son, is this idea of closeness, this idea of leaning against each other. Now, the funny thing is, this nickname, the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple in some translation, is going to show up 6 more times by the end of John's gospel. Now, most people believe, most scholars are pretty sure that John is talking about himself here. Now, again, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of actual real people, real disciples, who read this. This was available for other disciples to read. In fact, some of them probably helped contribute. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if one of your siblings, if you have brothers or sisters, and they wrote some sort of biography of your parents, and as you're reading it, you read it and you're like, the child who was mom and dad's favorite, right? You'd be like, pardon? So these other disciples would have read the disciple whom Jesus loved. And be like, seriously, John, laying it on a bit thick, don't you think? Right? Except they understood it to be true, because what does Peter do? Peter, who's sitting right there, Jesus is right there, Peter's right there. Peter says to John, ask him who it is. He could have asked him himself, but why does he gets John to do it? Why? Because they understood that there was a relationship between John and Jesus that was just a little bit different than the relationship the rest of them had. Now, it wasn't because Jesus wasn't willing. I think it's probably because John was the only one willing to actually be that vulnerable. Peter always seems to have a bit of an edge, and the disciples all kind of seem to be a bit standoffish, and you have sort of the 3, but of them, John doesn't seem to put up any walls. John is going to take whatever level of connection Jesus is willing to give, and he's going to humble himself and let all of his issues go just to have that. And so much so that even in this passage, Peter understands that, yeah, John actually was the disciple whom Jesus loved, which I think is hilarious and fascinating. But I also think it's an example for us to think about. I think every one of the disciples and every one of us is capable of having that relationship. It's not based on Jesus' willingness. It's based on our willingness. But one of the things that I think at Vox that a lot of us struggle with, myself included, is that a lot of us come to faith with some baggage. We come to faith with some frustration and some anger. We come to this, we're still here and we're still a part of this, and we still want to try to figure out what it means to follow Jesus, but we're upset sometimes. We're frustrated sometimes. We don't understand why God does what God does, and there's that wall that we tend to put up between ourselves and God. Because just like those relationships that we have on earth where we're not sure if we can trust, we've been burned one too many times before, we kind of have the same thing sometimes when we come to God in our relationship with Jesus. Is I don't know if I can trust. I don't know if I can lean back and recline against Jesus' chest, because I don't know. I feel like I've been burned before. But what an amazing example. Because what's also important is, remember, I keep talking about how Jesus is the best example we have of God. And Jesus is okay with this relationship. He's okay with it. He doesn't tell John, hey, come on, seriously, man, back off a little bit. Give me my personal space, man. He doesn't push John away. He doesn't try to not play favorites, like John. Seriously, the other disciples are going to start talking, and I don't want them to get all upset. And I got to treat all of you equally. And rabbis don't have favorite disciples, that kind of thing. And then what a beautiful example that we don't need to grovel. We don't need to be afraid. We don't need to. John has this relationship because he's the one who takes advantage of it. It's right there. Anybody could have. And he's the only one who seems to. And so there's this idea of this incredible deep love, the disciple whom Jesus loved. There's this reality. But that's not where the story ends. John continues in John chapter 13:26. So Jesus has said, somebody's going to betray me, and Peter's like, John, ask him who it is. And so John leans back and he asks Jesus, which one is it? And Jesus answered, it's the one to whom I will give this piece of bread once I have dipped it into the bowl. Then he dipped the piece of bread and he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son. And after Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. And Jesus told him, what you are about to do quickly. No one sitting at the table understood why Jesus said this to him. Some thought that since Judas kept the money bag, Jesus had told him to go buy what we need for the feast, or that he should go give some money to the poor. So when Judas took the bread, he left immediately, and it was night. Can you imagine how Jesus felt? There's no wonder he's deeply troubled, deeply disturbed, the translation says. 3 years. This isn't 3 years they worked at the same workplace. This isn't 3 years they were friends and they got together once every other week. 3 years they ate, they slept, they journeyed, they lived together 24/7 for the most part for 3 years. The disciple wanted to be as close as they could to their rabbi. They'd be just like their rabbi. I've taught on this. They were right behind them. They were following their rabbi like little chicks following the mother hen kind of thing. 3 years of that. Imagine how Jesus felt. How would you feel? 3 years of all of this, and you know that he's going to betray you. And he's not just going to betray you, he's betraying you for money. Famously, 30 pieces of silver for money. Now, there's all these arguments. Maybe he betrayed him because he was a zealot and he believed that if he handed him over, then Jesus would finally have to fight back and this would usher in God's kingdom. There's all these arguments to try to make sense of it, but it doesn't matter at the end, right? Because at the end, there's still two people. There's Jesus and Judas, and he betrays him. I mean, most of us have never experienced betrayal on that level, but we've experienced betrayal. Most of us have experienced friends who have turned on us, friends who have ghosted us, friends who have just wandered out of our lives as if we never mattered to them. Friends who have hurt us, broken us. And some of us, man, we still carry that around. I talk about it. You can feel it right now. And Jesus has just washed Judas' feet. I try to imagine that moment. I try to imagine that Jesus is on his knees and he's holding Judas' feet in his hands. And they're dirty and smelly and dusty, and he's washing Judas' feet, and he knows. And I wonder if this is what led to that. Jesus was deeply disturbed. Because he knew what was coming, but in this moment, he just was feeling it. But Judas sat there. He knew what he was going to do. And he sat there, and Jesus is holding his feet in his hands. Imagine. You know what's really fascinating about this too is that Jesus he's done washing the disciples' feet. He's finished washing Judas' feet, and he gets up and he says all this stuff about somebody's going to betray him in this old conversation. He says, I'm going to dip my bread. I'm going to dip my bread, and then I'm going to hand it to somebody. And the person that I hand it to, They're the one that's going to betray me. Now, like I said earlier, like this didn't make any sense to the disciples, you can tell, because to us it's pretty clear. Like he just said that, he hands it to Judas. You'd think everybody's going to be like, oh, it's Judas, but they still don't understand, right? They're all like, oh, no, it can't be Judas. It can't be him, right? And so all this sort of happens, but what's really fascinating is as I was kind of studying, N.T. Wright makes this comment, and he says, dipping a piece of bread in the dish and passing it to somebody was actually a sign of special friendship. That was actually like a privileged, honored, it was like a, hey, you get the edge of the brownie. You get the special bit because you're the special guest today. You're the special friend. Like, do you feel the layers? Do you feel the weight? Do you feel all of this sitting on the shoulders of everybody involved? Because here's the thing. We read it like, well, yeah, it's Jesus, and this is the Passion Week, and this is going to happen, and this happens, and then Jesus goes to the cross, and then, yay, we're done. I think that Jesus wasn't deeply troubled in his spirit as God incarnate, as the Son of God. I think that Jesus was deeply troubled in his spirit as Yeshua Bar Yosef, as Jesus, son of Joseph, as Jesus, the human friend of Judas. Jesus is troubled like you and I are troubled sometimes. Anyway. Have you ever jumped off something high? You know, like really high. Like not to die or anything, hopefully, but you know what I mean. Like jumped off something really high. Like we've been as a Bent House family a few times to Cypress Lake to go camping there. And one of the best things to do is to go to the grotto, which is never this, void of people. But it's one of the best places because it's legal again to jump off the cliffs in Tobermory. And it's a great place to go cliff jumping if you've never done it because there's like cliffs from little 5-foot little drop-offs to you can die 100 feet. Don't jump off those ones. But there's cliffs kind of all the way up. And so if you really wanted to try it, you can oh, okay, that's a good one. And then a little higher. Oh, that's a good, a little higher. Ooh, I don't know about that. A little high. Nope, too high. Right? You can kind of do that. Anyways, I know it's a bit of a change of direction, but bear with me. Now, one of my favorite things to do is I love cliffs, and I love jumping off them. But when there's usually 1 million people around, one of my favorite things to do is to watch people jump off cliffs. And you can watch the internal struggle of somebody who's standing at the top of something high, trying desperately to convince themselves that they're going to do this thing. I love watching they're kind of and you can see trying to tforce the body, but everything in particular, the lizard brain is no, don't do this. This is stupid, right? I love it. It was funny because I got there once and somebody's like, it's okay, you can do it. And I was standing there and I realized I looked like them and I'm like, oh, I'm not afraid of heights. The water's very cold. I got dried off. I don't want to go back in the water. Anyway. Now, I jumped off this one. Can you go to the next slide? That one's about 60 feet down to the water there, maybe 55 feet, somewhere around there. And one of my favorite things to do when you're having a hard time is to get a little bit of a run at it because you can't stop once you get the momentum going, you know what I mean? So but the thing about cliff jumping is there's no way to ease into cliff jumping. If the water's cold, you go in your feet, okay, you go up to your knees. You can kind of acclimatize if the water's cold. But cliff jumping, there's no easing into it. You jump, it's binary. There's jumping or not jumping. Those are the options. You are in the air, you're not in the air. Those are the options. And I kind of like that about it, maybe. I don't know. I kind of feel like it simplifies some things. I like that moment where you're in the air and you're like, I'm like a bird. No, I'm not. Bang, and then you hit the water. But for a split second, it feels like you're a bird, and it's pretty awesome. My problem is, though, I'm very easily mesmerized by things. And so I have a bad habit I like to jump and watch the water, but then I'm like, oh, look at the pretty whack, and then you go smack your face or whatever. Get a little bit hypnotized. Not so good, really, but anyways. Jesus did this as well, not in Tobermory necessarily. Well, maybe he has, I don't know. Not that I'm aware of. But this idea of jumping, this idea of it is either you do it or you don't do it. There's just something in here that I kind of got thinking about. N.T. Wright, in his commentary on this passage, he said something that really stuck with me. He says, in the middle of the picture, we have Jesus. And so there's this picture that's laid out for us in this sort of Last Supper. He says, in the middle of the picture, we have Jesus flanked by love and betrayal. Love on one side, leaning against him, betrayal on the other. Perhaps they always go together in this life. The joy and the agony, the intimacy and the knife in the back. Maybe Jesus' openness to the one meant that he was bound to be open to the other as well. And maybe it's like that for us too. This idea that there's no way for trust to be earned in a new relationship. That phrase, trust has to be earned, is nice and it's quaint and it sounds good. It's bullshit, but it sounds really good. Because trust can't be earned. It has to be given. If it's earned, it's not trust, it's just simply knowledge. It's knowledge about somebody's character, it's knowledge about who they are. For it to be trust, there has to be an element of uncertainty. There has to be an element of unknowing. I don't know if I can trust this person, but I'm going to. You either jump or you don't jump. You either open yourself up to new relationships or you close yourself off. Wright continues. So he says, maybe it's like that for us too. If and when it is, there's strange comfort to be had in Jesus' words to Judas. Do it quickly, he said. He knew the agony that awaited him, and he didn't want it to go on any longer than it had to. As in 12:27, so here in 13:21, Jesus is troubled in spirit. There is no shame in spirit trouble. It's what you get when you're a foot washer, a generous love person, open to deep friendship and to the serious wounds that only friends can give. And if the research is accurate, we're all going through this right now. We're all struggling. We're all having to decide if we're going to open ourselves up to be hurt again. We all have to decide if we're going to do the work, put the work in that's necessary because to open ourselves up to relationship, to love, to connection, to intimacy, to authenticity, to support, to encouragement, to all of the things that come when we journey with someone and do life with somebody else. To do that opens ourselves up to the awkwardness, to the difficulties, to the pain, to sometimes sorrow, to the struggles, to the tensions that come with those relationships as well. There's no way to develop the relationships that we all need in our lives without the risk of betrayal. Without the risk of what might come, of the pain that might come, and maybe betrayal is a tough word, is a heavy word, but it's still that opening ourselves up to the risk that maybe it's going to be difficult, that we have to have hard conversations. Now, I know this doesn't maybe seem like the most encouraging message on one hand. I wasn't sure what to preach about Judas. I mean, it's Judas. There's not a lot of good. I mean, there's only a few names in history that nobody uses anymore. And Judas, there's not a lot of Judases being born, right? You know, nobody's like, oh, I'm going to name my little baby Judas. It's not, there's a few names we're just like, nope, they're stricken from the record of all of humanity, right? But look at the relationship that John has with Jesus. Because they're both there. Jesus, I love that line. Jesus is flanked by love and betrayal. And so I wanted to remind us all again, this is the point of the rule of three at Vox. This is why we talked about it before, and I think it's why it is so much more important now and moving forward. Relationships don't happen by accident. They need to be intentional. We were talking about this before the service. I always say that a relationship can't be static. A relationship is either growing and becoming closer and deeper, or it is moving backwards. It is atrophying. It is stagnating. It doesn't just sit still. We need to be intentional about developing the relationships that we have, and I think for a lot of us, looking to develop new relationships as well. Reconnecting with people who we lost touch of over the last couple of years. Reconnecting with people that actually used to matter in our lives, and we've kind of let that slip. We need to retrain our ability to connect. I think a lot of us have lost some of those skills. Last night was awesome at O'Hara's. It was a great time. And it was so fun to see some of the Vox people out. It was amazing. I was saying earlier, like singing Finally Free and hearing everybody singing was incredible. It was funny to watch the reactions of people. It was fun to watch, like, even people who had clearly no idea what the song is, but that, oh, and all of a sudden, like, I'm looking at people that I sit at the bar with, probably too often, too regularly, singing along, right? And I was like, this is hilarious. It was amazing. But it was so good because it was also to see the Vox family doing what we do. Or maybe what we did. To live life together, to be present together, to see people who maybe normally wouldn't necessarily find themselves in the same mix. And then to see some new people added in, and then a few drunk people stumble in and get to be part of that. That's the beauty of what that intentionality can create, because the intentionality creates the opportunity for the unexpected. But it brings with the possibility for pain. Our numbers are not what they used to be. Now, some people have wandered away because they don't like our stance on some things. Some people have moved, and it hurts. It hurts when they leave. It hurts when we come to know somebody and they become a part of our lives, and then they move to places like BC and Thunder Bay and, things like that. And it hurts. But I think it's so important. What relationships are you avoiding right now? What relationships do you need to reinvest in? What relationships need your focus right now? I'm going to close with what N.T. Wright said there. We are called to be foot washers. We are called to be generous, loving people, open to deep friendships and open to the serious wounds that only friends can give. That's worship team. Come on up. Let's pray.